Welcome back to Quiet Maghreb Crimes. Today, we peel back the intricate layers of 5 harrowing real-life mysteries that took place 100% here in Morocco. From the dark alleyways of suburban housing developments to desolate coastlines, remote farmsteads, and fog-shrouded national highways, these stories expose the extreme bounds of human dark psychology, sudden betrayal, and unyielding vengeance. Sit back, lower the lights, and walk with us step by step as we unpack the chilling details of these untold cases. Our first case takes us back to 2012, to the desolate, unfinished outskirts of Casablanca, in a newly constructed, 4-story concrete building situated in an informal housing sector. 4 families lived in a state of constant, suffocating tension. The builder had sold off the individual apartments raw, leaving the exterior walls unplastered, the central stairwell dark and exposed, and the building completely devoid of shared maintenance. Without a unified agreement on basic upkeep, minor disagreements between neighbors slowly escalated into a silent, bitter war. Living on the 3rd floor was a 45-year-old night watchman, unmarried, solitary, and deeply set in his ways. He worked long, exhausting night shifts, guarding an industrial site. By day, while the rest of the building went about its routine, he tried to sleep. But in a thin, walled building filled with lively families and young children, peace was impossible. Over time, his sleep deprivation morphed into a simmering, dangerous malice toward his neighbors. The breaking point arrived during the onset of the cold winter season. The owner of the 2nd-floor apartment, desperate to stop heavy rain from seeping through the unplastered exterior bricks, hired a small crew of private painters. To reach the 2nd floor, the workers assembled a temporary exterior scaffolding suspended high above the concrete alleyway. To anchor the heavy wooden planks from the rooftop, the painters used long wooden support beams weighted down by roughly 15 heavy canvas bags filled with dry sand. The work began early in the morning. The sound of metal poles clattering, the painters shouting to one another, and their young teenage assistant mixing red weatherproofing paint reverberated through the open stairwell. Disturbed from his sleep, the night watchman exploded. He stormed out onto the scaffolding platform, screaming at the workers. When the teenage assistant shouted back, telling him to take his complaints to the homeowner, the watchman lost control. He grabbed a heavy wooden stick and struck the young assistant across the face. Hearing the commotion, the 2nd-floor homeowner rushed outside, pulled the watchman back, and severely beat him in front of the workers, humiliating him in his own doorway. Bruised, overpowered, and trembling with rage, the watchman retreated into his dark apartment. But he was not going to let the insult pass. The following afternoon, at around 1:30 p.m., local police and emergency services received an urgent distress call from the neighborhood. 2 young painters had suddenly plunged from the 3rd-story scaffolding, landing headfirst onto the concrete street below. Both men suffered immediate, catastrophic skull fractures and died instantly. A passing mother and her young daughter narrowly escaped being crushed, though the mother was struck by falling debris. At first glance, it appeared to be a tragic workplace accident, a failure of temporary equipment. But when forensic officers and investigative detectives climbed to the rooftop to examine the anchor system, the scene told a far more sinister story. The heavy wooden beams that held the scaffold cables were completely flipped. Resting beside them were 15 canvas sandbags, but not a single one was intact. Every single bag had been systematically sliced open with a razor-sharp blade. As the painters worked on the platform below, the dry sand had steadily leaked out of the long, clean cuts. Gram by gram, the counterweight vanished until the wooden beams yielded, instantly catapulting the two young men into the air. This was not an equipment failure. It was a double homicide, meticulously planned to look like an accident. Detectives immediately began questioning the residents, and the second floor owner pointed directly to the solitary night watchman, detailing the violent altercation from the previous day. Officers knocked on the watchman's door, but there was no response. Neighbors confirmed he had been seen entering his apartment earlier that morning after his night shift, wearing his heavy winter coat. Investigators moved to his workplace, an industrial factory on the town limits. They found him stepping into his shift early, carrying a backpack. When officers approached him for questioning, his reaction was strangely aggressive. Rather than asking what had happened, he immediately invoked legal technicalities, shouting that he was a free citizen and that police had no right to question him. That immediate defensive posture sealed his fate. Officers detained him and searched his backpack. Tucked inside his guard uniform was a utility folding knife with traces of canvas fiber and dry sand still embedded in the hinge. Back at the station, under relentless interrogation, his cold facade finally cracked war. He confessed that after being beaten by the homeowner, he spent the night plotting revenge. He knew he couldn't overpower the men physically, so he targeted the scaffolding. Early that morning, while the crew was taking a break, he crept up to the roof with his utility knife, methodically slashing every single counterweight bag before returning to his bed to wait for gravity to do his dark work. The watchman was formally charged with double cold-blooded murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. A minor dispute over noise and pride had cost two young men their lives and locked a bitter man away for the rest of his natural days. While some killers act out of petty neighborhood grudges, others operate under a horrifying distortion of cultural pride and misplaced honor. Our second case moves away from the concrete sprawl of Casablanca into a quiet, traditional agricultural village on the night of Eid al-Adha. The village was alive with celebration, as families gathered to share meals and visit relatives. But at around 9:30 p.m., a distraught father walked into the local gendarmerie station. He reported that his 15-year-old daughter had vanished. She had left their modest rural home at 4:30 p.m. to walk to her uncle's house, located roughly 1 kilometer away across a flat agricultural landscape. She was supposed to join the extended family for the evening feast, but she never arrived. In rural communities where everyone knows their neighbors, a 15-year-old girl missing for several hours after dark was an immediate red flag. Local gendarmes launched an urgent search, mobilizing villagers to comb the surrounding tracts and farm properties. Late that night, a breakthrough occurred when an 11-year-old local boy spoke to the missing girl's uncle. The boy mentioned that earlier that evening, while riding his bicycle near the edge of the local forest, he had seen the teenager. She was standing near a dirt track, talking to a 23-year-old local youth who was sitting on the ground drinking alcohol with two friends. Upon hearing this, the girl's uncle did not inform the police. Instead, He claimed to the family that the young boy was lying and told everyone to keep searching the main roads. At 7:30 the following morning, a local farmer walking out to inspect his barley field made a horrifying discovery. Hidden deep within the tall green stalks, 20 meters off the main dirt track, lay the lifeless body of the 15-year-old girl. She was face down in the soil, surrounded by a pool of dried blood. Responding gendarmes and forensic teams secured the field. An initial examination revealed catastrophic blunt force trauma to the back of her head. The strike had been delivered with immense power, shattering her skull instantly. Crucially, the forensic medical examiner confirmed that the girl had not been sexually assaulted, nor were there any defensive wounds on her hands or arms. She had been struck down from behind while running. Suspicion initially fell upon the 23-year-old youth seen drinking near the forest. Gendarmes picked him up from his house. He was still visibly intoxicated and defensive, but under questioning, both he and his two friends provided a consistent, verified timeline. He admitted that he had a secret, innocent friendship with the girl. They had met briefly at the forest edge that evening, but as they stood talking, the young boy on the bicycle had ridden past. Fearing rumors, the girl told him she had to leave immediately and walked away toward the main road. The youth and his friends remained by the forest until 8 p.m. before going home. Detectives turned their attention back to the timeline provided by the family. They re-examined the 11-year-old bicycle boy, who revealed a critical detail that changed the entire direction of the investigation. The boy stated that after seeing the girl by the forest, he had ridden straight to her uncle's house to warn him. When the uncle heard that his niece was seen near a group of young men drinking alcohol, he flew into a quiet, murderous rage. The boy watched as the uncle grabbed a heavy wooden club, a severed tool handle, mounted his motorcycle, and sped off into the dark. Minutes later, the uncle returned alone, threatening the boy never to speak of what he saw. Gendarmes immediately brought the uncle back into the station. When confronted with the boy's testimony and the forensic report showing a single, massive strike from behind, the uncle broke down. He confessed everything. He explained that when he heard the rumor, he was consumed by toxic shame, fearing the family's reputation in the village would be ruined. He grabbed the wooden club, rode his motorcycle to the forest track, and spotted his niece walking back alone. He confronted her, screaming questions about what she was doing. Terrified by his violent demeanor, the young girl turned and ran into the tall barley field to hide. The uncle pursued her through the dark stalks. As she fled, he swung the wooden club with all his strength, striking her squarely in the back of the head. She collapsed instantly into the dirt. Realizing she was dead, he panicked, hid the club, and returned to the village, actively participating in the search party to cover his tracks. The uncle was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 23 years in prison for homicide. A young life was brutally cut short, not by a violent stranger, but by the very relative who claimed to protect her honor. The dark human impulse to eliminate witnesses and erase evidence takes many forms. But few crimes match the calculated, horrifying lengths taken by a group of brothers in the rural outskirts of Taza in 2004. It began on a dry, windy morning when a local farmer walking near an isolated agricultural plot noticed a plume of strange dark smoke rising from a ditch. Investigating the source, he stumbled upon a sight that chilled him to the bone: the completely charred, skeletal remains of a human being. The fire had burned so fiercely that the soft tissue was entirely consumed, leaving only a scorched skeleton resting in the ash. The local Royal Gendarmerie and forensic crime scene investigators rushed to the field. The scene was horrifyingly clean. The killer had poured gallons of pure gasoline over the victim, letting the fire burn unchecked in the open air. To recover any trace evidence, detectives brought in sifting screens, carefully filtering the ash surrounding the bones. Their efforts yielded only 4 items: a damaged brass ring, 2 cheap metallic men's necklaces, a melted jacket zipper, and a steel belt buckle. Forensic pathologists at the regional lab confirmed that the victim was a male aged between 30 and 35. More importantly, the autopsy revealed that the victim did not die from the fire and the skull exhibited severe, radiating fractures caused by multiple crushing blows with a heavy, blunt object. He had been murdered elsewhere, transported to the field, and set ablaze to ensure he could never be identified. For over 3 weeks, the case remained a total mystery. No missing persons reports matched the description, and a wave of paranoia swept through the surrounding rural communities. The breakthrough came purely by accident. Gendarmes received a routine missing person inquiry from an elderly woman in Taza. She reported that her 32-year-old son, a farmhand who lived in a small rented house, had not been seen for over a month. She mentioned that his wife had temporarily moved to Fez following a family argument, leaving him living alone. When neighbors noticed 2 unknown young men using keys to enter his house and host late night drinking sessions, they alerted the mother. Detectives presented the small pieces of recovered jewelry to the mother. The moment she saw the cheap metallic necklaces and the brass ring, she dissolved into tears. They belonged to her missing son. Investigators tracked down the farm where the victim had been employed. The farm was owned by an elderly landholder and worked by his 3 adult sons. When gendarmes first questioned the farm owner, he claimed the victim had simply quit his job a month prior after receiving his final wages. However, when detectives interviewed the farm owner's brother, who owned a neighboring plot, a completely different story emerged. The brother blurted out that the missing worker was a thief who had orchestrated a massive robbery on his brother's farm weeks ago, stealing a large herd of valuable cattle. This massive discrepancy blew the case wide open. Detectives brought the farm owner, his 3 sons, and the farm's night watchman into custody for separate, isolated interrogations. Under intense pressure, the night watchman broke. He revealed that weeks earlier, an armed gang had raided the farm at night, tying up the watchman and his family before driving off with the livestock. During the robbery, the watchman recognized the insider who was guiding the thieves. It was the 32-year-old victim. When the farm owner's sons confirmed that their trusted worker was the mastermind behind their financial ruin, they decided not to involve the police. Instead, they sought private, violent revenge. The 3 brothers hunted down the worker, snatching him from his home and bringing him back to a secluded barn on the farm. They tied him up and began a brutal interrogation, demanding to know where the stolen cattle had been sold. As the victim shouted back and refused to cooperate, the eldest brother lost control. He picked up a massive wooden club made from a dense tree root and struck the bound man repeatedly across the head, shattering his skull. Within minutes, the worker died on the barn floor. Panicked by the body in front of them, the three brothers devised a plan inspired by international crime films. They loaded the corpse into a pickup truck, drove it miles away to the isolated plot outside Taza, doused it in gasoline, and set it on fire, believing that without an identity, there could be no murder investigation. The three brothers and their accomplices were convicted. The eldest brother, who delivered the fatal blows and orchestrated the burning, received a capital sentence, while his brothers and accomplices were sentenced to decades behind hard bars. Or, not all murders take place in secluded fields. Sometimes, the most cold-blooded betrayals occur in plain sight, along heavily traveled highways fueled by sudden financial greed. At 6 a.m. on a freezing, foggy winter morning in 2013, drivers traveling along the national highway outside Coriga spotted a dark shape lying motionless on the asphalt shoulder. Responding Royal Gendarmerie officers found the body of a well-dressed, clean-shaven man in his early 40s with distinct graying hair. The crime scene was violent. The victim had suffered a crushing blow to the side of his head, and a single, fatal knife wound plunged directly through his heart. His pockets were turned inside out. His mobile phone, wallet, cash, and identity papers were gone. Most importantly, investigators learned from his family that he always traveled on a brand new motorcycle, which was completely missing from the scene. For 48 hours, the victim remained an unidentified John Doe in the municipal morgue. The break came when an elderly man and his eldest son arrived at the gendarmerie station, searching for a 42-year-old independent real estate broker who had failed to return home. At the morgue, the tearful father identified the victim as his missing son. With no physical evidence at the roadside crime scene, detectives launched a technical investigation, obtaining judicial clearance to track the victim's mobile phone records and coordinate with regional cyber units. But while the technical team worked, field officers caught a massive break at a routine late-night highway checkpoint. A veteran Grand taxi driver stopped at the checkpoint and recognized the victim's published photo. He provided a crucial piece of eyewitness testimony. He recalled that on the night of the murder, between 8 and 9 p.m., he was driving home when he saw the victim standing near a popular roadside food tent. The victim was arguing heatedly with a tall, heavily built man in his late 40s wearing a distinct vest. Both men were visibly intoxicated. The taxi driver remembered pulling over, offering them a ride, but the heavy, set man refused to let the broker enter the vehicle. The driver heard the broker plead with his companion, calling him by name. "Please, brother, let's talk about this tomorrow." Equipped with a physical description and a first name, gendarmes swept the local establishments of Coriga. They traced the suspect's identity to a specific downtown cafe, a well-known meeting spot for local real estate brokers, contractors, and middlemen. The cafe owner recognized both men immediately. He revealed a vital piece of information on the night of the murder. The victim had left his brand new motorcycle parked inside the cafe's private garage. The broker had explicitly told the owner that he was leaving his bike behind because it was raining heavily, and that he was taking a ride home in his colleague's blue Citroën. Detectives moved swiftly, surrounding the residence of the 47-year-old suspect. When officers confronted him, He maintained an extraordinarily calm demeanor. He admitted to knowing the victim and claimed he had simply given his friend a ride to the highway junction before driving home alone. However, detectives carried out a court-authorized search of his blue Citroën. Sitting parked in his driveway, the vehicle appeared clean, but when officers popped open the passenger side glove compartment, they recovered the smoking gun, the victim's switched-off smartphone, his leather wallet containing his national identity card, and the official ownership papers for the missing motorcycle. Cornered by physical evidence, the killer's cold composure broke down. He confessed to the brutal murder. He explained that earlier that day, the two brokers had successfully closed a lucrative land transaction, collecting a massive cash commission. They went out drinking together inside his car to celebrate. But as the alcohol took effect, a bitter argument erupted over the split. The suspect accused the victim of keeping a larger portion of the cash for himself. As the dispute escalated, the suspect pulled his car over to a dark, tree-lined stretch of the highway. When the victim stepped out to hail a grand taxi, the suspect retrieved a small utility knife from his door pocket, followed him into the dark, and plunged the blade directly into his heart. As the broker collapsed onto the rain-soaked gravel, the killer picked up a heavy rock, crushed his skull to ensure he was dead, cleaned out his pockets, and drove away into the fog. The suspect was convicted of premeditated murder and armed robbery, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment. A lifetime behind bars, born out of a sudden, senseless burst of greed over a temporary handful of cash. Our final case brings us to a quiet coastal sector near El Jadida, where a mysterious scene on a deserted beach exposed a cold, terrifying narrative of romantic deception and callous indifference. It began on a dark, stormy morning when early visitors walking along a secluded stretch of coastline noticed a luxury four-wheel drive SUV parked unusually close to the surf. The driver's door was left ajar, and sea spray was washing over the tires. Approaching the vehicle, bystanders were shocked to find a tiny toddler sleeping peacefully in a child's seat in the back, completely unattended. Responding police officers searched the vehicle's interior. Inside a discarded handbag on the passenger seat, they found identification documents belonging to a young local woman. However, the registration papers for the luxury SUV belonged to a man currently residing and working abroad in Europe. Investigators rushed to the registered owner's address in El Jadida. The owner's sister explained that her brother had been living in Europe for months. She identified the missing woman as her brother's wife, who lived in the home with her young child. The family revealed that they had last spoken to the woman at 3 p.m. the previous afternoon, when she mentioned she was driving to visit relatives in a nearby town. Since then, both of her mobile phones had been switched off, and her whereabouts were completely unknown. A local parking attendant near the beach provided detectives with a critical breakthrough. He recalled seeing the luxury SUV arrive at the coastal lot the previous evening during a heavy rainstorm. Driving the vehicle was a well-dressed man in his early 40s, a man the attendant recognized as a frequent visitor to the area. Crucially, the attendant confirmed that the driver was not the overseas husband. He was accompanied by the missing young mother. 2 days later, the ocean yielded its dark secret. The lifeless body of a woman wearing a bright red jalaba washed ashore in a restricted rocky zone several kilometers down the coast. At the municipal morgue, the family confirmed the victim was the missing mother. The preliminary autopsy report noted that while the cause of death was drowning, her body bore unmistakable signs of extreme violence. Her nose was broken, and she had suffered severe blunt force trauma to her face and jaw before entering the water. Police reviewed security footage from a Sea View cafe identified by the parking attendant. The video captured the victim sitting with a 41-year-old local bakery owner. The footage showed an intense, hostile conversation before the two walked out together toward the SUV. Armed with the footage and technical phone location data, officers arrested the baker at his business. Under intense interrogation, his initial lies disintegrated. He confessed to a dark, calculated affair. He explained that he had been seeing the victim secretly for months, while her husband was abroad, lavishing her with gifts and money under the impression that she was going to divorce her husband. But on that stormy afternoon, the victim dropped a bombshell. She revealed that her husband had finalized her European visa paperwork, and that she was leaving Morocco permanently to join him abroad. Enraged by the realization that he had been manipulated and used for financial gain, the baker demanded his money and gifts back. When she refused and mocked him, he drove her to the isolated beach parking lot under the cover of rain and darkness. An intense argument broke out inside the vehicle. The baker grabbed her, dragged her out of the SUV, and savagely beat her across the face until she lost consciousness on the sand. Observing her motionless body, he dragged her into the freezing ocean waves, pushing her into a deep current where she drowned. He then walked back to the SUV, retrieved her 2 mobile phones to prevent location tracking, wiped down the steering wheel and door handles with tissues to remove his fingerprints, and walked away into the dark, leaving her innocent toddler alone in the back seat as the tide slowly rose around the vehicle, hoping the sea would erase his horrific crime forever. The baker was tried, convicted of aggravated murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment. 5 dark stories. 5 devastating reminders of how quickly pride, greed, honor, and rage can dismantle human lives. Every single detail, every investigation, and every tragic loss happened right here in Morocco. Thank you for listening to Quiet Maghreb Crimes. If you found these cases compelling, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and good night.